Like a Rolling Stone, a memoir by Jann Wenner, read by Garvey Peterson. Part 2. Chapter 1. Rainbow Road. I grew up on Rainbow Road, the name my parents gave the dirt lane that led to the home they had built in a valley filled with oak trees. Lemon bushes surrounded the house, and red bougainvillea covered the arbors that shaded the patios. It was when I learned my first lessons about life and what lay ahead. We lived in the rural suburbs of San Rafael, California, the county seat of Marin, which would become a mecca of the hippies in the 60s and of the hip in the 70s. It lay just north of the Golden Gate Bridge. The highway from San Francisco was a 2-lane road. That was before freeways in the new towns were built into the baby boom. My parents, Ruth Naomi Simmons and Edward Wenner, were from New York City, where they had met looking to share a ride to ski in Vermont. Both had joined the armed forces during the war. She was stationed in New Orleans as a quartermaster in the Navy. He was a lieutenant based in Monroe, Alabama, with the Army Air Corps, where he taught pilots and navigators how to drop bombs. After they married in 1943 and had me, they decided to leave New York, packed up a car, and set out to find their new life in California. The population of the United States in 1964 was 140 million. Today it is 350 million. I was born on January 7th, 1946. Which put me at the leading edge of the generation that would be the largest, best educated, and wealthiest in American history. My pediatrician in New York City was Dr. Benjamin Spock, the man who wrote the modern rules for raising children with love, not punishment, which was mocked as spare the rod, spoil the child. My parents started a business where they moved to San Francisco. It was called Baby Formulas, a service that provided custom-made bottles of formula for hospitals in the Bay Area. Work kept them away from home in the early years, and my sisters, Kate, born in 1947, and Marty, born in 1949, and I, were raised most days by our housekeeper, Bia, who lived 30 minutes away in a segregated housing project for blacks, then called colored people. The problem with Rainbow Road from a child's point of view was that we didn't have a nearby neighbors, so it was hard to make friends. We were never like the neighbors anyway. For one thing, both of my parents worked, and my mother's, who did, were considered strange, almost aliens, and we were Jews. Being non-observant Jews was a meaningful difference in the neighborhood. My sisters and I would walk the 2 miles to town over a hill along the train tracks, leaving pennies on the rails to see them flattened by passing trains. We'd go to movies on Saturday afternoons, buy 10-cent ice cream cones, and get a free See's chocolate candy from the nice lady there, who watched my sisters and me, apparently penniless, stare at her display case. I was a pudgy kid with freckles, a cowlick, a toothy smile, big ears, and blue eyes. If I was concentrating, say, on reading a book, my tongue would hang out. I was also what in those days was called a problem child. I had been kicked out of 2 private schools in San Francisco. The first, a nursery school, explained that I was just too much trouble. In early grade school, I deliberately hid in the bushes on a field trip to the San Francisco Zoo. This caused a panic for my parents, the police, and the school. I showed up at a police station later that day, as I wandered across the city helplessly looking for my parents at the baby formula's offices. The school also gave me the heave-ho. My parents, together with a few other families who lived on the right side of the tracks, founded a private school, Marin County Day, where my sisters went. As a 5th grader, I was too old then and was sent to the local public school. Most of the kids there lived in Raphael Meadows, on the other side of the tracks, about 200 tract home built for blue-collar families. My 2 best friends lived there. One's father was a fireman, and the other's dad was an inmate at San Quentin. We would hang out at Danny's, a grocery store where we did most of our shoplifting. It had a payphone outside, where we could make free calls by sticking a bobby pin in the coin box. In the summers, my sisters and I would cut open cardboard boxes and race them down the dry grass on the hills around the house or splash around in the creek. It had a footbridge that led to a small island where we built a fortress. Every summer we were sent to Camp Lagunitas in the backwoods of rural Marin, a funky place that the Grateful Dead would rent years later. The camp's owner was a full-tilt alcoholic who could be found asleep in the middle of the day on top of a picnic table. Some of us 10-year-olds would use that time for risky hijinks. I commandeered a boat with a 75 horsepower Evinrude outboard engine and came within inch of smashing full speed into the dock. My friends and I dove off an old pier until we were warned about the underwater cables that could slice our heads open. While we were there, our folks took driving tips to Canada, Mexico, and throughout the West. We got picture postcards of giant redwoods, Paul Bunyan statues, and tourist monuments of all kinds, a photo gallery of the 50s. They wrote us lots of letters, all of which I saved, beginning of my obsession with filing and keeping everything. My mother sent updates on the Sunday comics and on family life. I am enclosing 3 news clippings which I thought would interest you. One is about a phone company man who was killed by wild bees. It frightened me when I read it to remember how you and Ricky and Jeff used to stone down the wild bees in our woods. We had a scientist over from Berkeley last night, and he told us some interesting things about radioactivity and the fallout from bomb tests. She stopped working in their business full-time and spent her days sitting in the sun at a typewriter. Before she married, she had been a freelance for magazines in New York, particularly ones about child rearing. As a qualified professional, she told me I was the most difficult child she ever encountered. Now she was working on a witty retelling of starting baby formulas by my dad titled Back Away from the Stove. It was mildly successful. A grammarless publicity photo of her holding the book appeared in the local papers. She mentioned all our names and said one good thing about getting the actual book in hand is that this justifies their having an unconventional mother. Everyone in our family was so proud. When I walked home from school each day, my mother would bring out fresh fruit and make me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. We would listen to the Army McCarthy hearings being broadcast on the radio from the U.S. Senate. It was a showdown between Senator Joseph McCarthy, a right-wing thug, a mudslinger from Wisconsin, and the United States Army, which he claimed was infiltrated by communists. All of this was above my 8-year-old head. But I was absorbing bits and pieces, learning about democracy, the Red Scare, and politics. I listened as the lawyer for the Army, Joseph Welch, famously challenged McCarthy. At long last, have you left no sense of decency? My parents were active in Democratic politics. They bought the liberty traditions of New York City to Republican California, a hotbed of conservatives and other ultras that gave us Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. My sisters and I stuffed envelopes and walked neighborhoods on Saturday afternoons to distribute buttons, bumper stickers, and yard signs. When Adlai Stevenson ran for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1956, my father was his Northern California campaign manager. I met Stevenson at cocktail parties with my dad and took a bus into San Francisco on my own to hear him speak at a rally. 10 years old, I started reading anything I could find on FDR. Why? My mother was one of the founders of the California Democratic Council. Along with future Senator Alan Cranston, it was a citizens' movement organized to win back California from the Republicans, and ultimately helped elect Pat Brown, Jerry's father, as governor. Mom also ran a congressional campaign defeating a long-term Republican. Politics were her mother's milk. It seemed we were never not involved. Around 6th grade, I decided to become an editor and publisher. I have no clue where or how this odd notion struck me. I was already a fanatic about our daily newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle. My mother and I read the columnists together, discussed the news, and relished Herb Caen's 3-dot gossip column, Baghdad by the Bay. The Weekly Trumpet, as my very first effort was moderately called, actually the initial name was the Up-to-the-Minute News, was printed by typing on a stencil, in opposite directions each quarter page, so it could be folded into a 4-page mini-magazine. The stencil was then copied on a diddle machine. Larry and Doug Ashby and I put together school news, neighborhood comings and goings, some gossip gleaned through our playmates, once about someone's parents discussing divorce, jokes for kids, and even political editorials. A copy cost a dime, and we had 60 subscribers. There was a story about us cute junior enterprisers on page 1 of the Marin County newspaper, but after 6 months, the three of us gave it a rest and divided up $40 profits. We announced a not to be consummated return in the fall with a monthly magazine, The Trumpeter. Instead, there was a 7th grade school newspaper, the Santa Vienta Informer, with announcements for the usual school activities, lists of kids looking to babysit, and a gossip column. Janice Rose likes Larry Ashby an awful lot. Maybe it's vice versa. Ronnie raves and Chris Doffing are girlfriend and boyfriend. Did you hear about when they went to Chris's house together? Ronnie rode the bike and Chris rocked and carried the books. Mary Nichols making it obvious it's a certain boy. The first record player I saw in my parents' 78 Garrard turntable was a component tube amp and a speaker my dad had mounted in the wall of the living room. That was just before rock and roll, which my parents would dislike. But their taste was eclectic enough to encompass Billie Holiday and Eartha Kitt, the Weavers, Broadway musicals, especially South Pacific, and lots of classical music, all of which I still love. My mother had strong training in piano, and most nights she would play Moonlight Sonata before sending us to bed. Mom and Dad also took us to see Gilbert and Sullivan, comedic operas. I can still sing the tunes from the Mikado. I think of those two Victorian composers as precursors to the Beatles. I thought my mother, who was called Sim, a contraction of her maiden name, was a special and different kind of mom. When I read Auntie Mamie, it all made sense. Our mother was a version of that outspoken, open-minded, and wacky lady who sent her nephew to a nursery school where the kids went naked and pretended they were fish. I fantasized that she really was Aunt Mamie. My mother's father, Maurice Simmons, was a Democrat, an anti-Tammany Hall reformer. He trained to become a Rough Rider in the Spanish-American War, but was too late to serve. He became a municipal judge. I ended up with 2 of his gavels. He founded the Jewish War Veterans of America. Maurice had married his first cousin, Zilla, one of 7 sisters from Australia, and had 2 children, my mom and her older brother, Robert. My father, Ed, was a businessman, building a business, and we saw him mostly on weekends, when he would spend the days on various household projects. He had a wood shop with table saws. He built beds for us with built-in drawers, made modern coffee tables, and put retaining walls against the hillsides around our house to hold back the mud during the rainy season. He was short but powerfully built. His passion was to make a success of baby formulas. His mother had run a lingerie store in New York, where he was the after-school assistant errand boy. He had gotten tangentially involved in an insurance fire scheme, and it soured him on her. I remember meeting her once, exchanging letters with an old lady, but otherwise she was not in our lives. We knew nothing of his father, never met a brother or a sister of his, and only knew that he was the youngest child called Baby Eddie. His mother had immigrated from Ukraine, but he had lost touch with all of his siblings except for his brother Sam, who he visited once in Boston. Dad made his business work by honesty and sweat. Baby formulas ended up feeding 90% of the babies born within 125 miles of San Francisco. He never stopped working, and that was the basis of my family's comfortable life. Dad only spanked me once. I don't think he liked it. The second time, my mom told him he had to spank me. I ran into the woods and didn't come home for an hour. That was the end of that. My father loved science fiction. He was subscribed to monthly pulp magazines with names like Galaxy and Amazing Stories. He saved every copy and had bookshelves packed with fantasy. When I discovered Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein, he had already been there and done that. He smoked pipes and carried around tins or pouches of Edgeworth tobacco, which gave off the scent of cherries. It was the early Mad Men era, so we saw a lot of benches and heads of cigarettes in boxes, scotch and sodas, and a steady flow of their friends, couples who also smoked and drank. As a kid, my father's recreation was hiking in the mountains, and he loved the outdoors until his last days. Our family's winter vacations were to ski areas around Lake Tahoe. The Squaw Valley Lodge became a vacation home for us kids. There were rec rooms and snack bars and enough safety to allow us our freedom. On weekends, I would wake up with Dad at 4:30 a.m., and the 2 of us would pack into his MGB and drive to Squaw Valley for 2 days of skiing. Our ritual was to have a pre-dawn breakfast at the Black Swan Diner on the way. Once at the mountain, he would meet up with his friends and cut me loose to learn how to ski on the rope toes. I quickly discovered that the chairlift was easier and took me all the way to the top. I love skiing with Dad, having grown up time together. Being the oldest child, the young man in the family, made me feel special. Skiing became my sport, going solo. The need for speed. My dad was a wit, and we used to laugh all the time. Those are my best memories of him from those days. When I was 10, Heartbreak Hotel came out, and there was no turning back. What what was it about that rhythm, that beat, those loud voices, those romantic harmonies for someone so young? I would pull the bed covers over my head and listen to a rocker-shaped crystal radio. When I got my first 45 RPM record player for the free single that came with it, I chose Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock. In 1959, as the Eisenhower era was coming to an end, I was in 7th grade. We had a Pat Boone club and an Elvis club. I joined the white suede shoes side, but then admitted I was wrong and switched to the blue suede shoed kind. The record I could not get enough of was Party Doll by Buddy Knox on Roulette Records. Knox is from Happy, Texas. I would wait for that line to come along. To come along with me when I'm feeling wild, to be ever loving, true and fair, to run fingers through my hair. He would drag out wild like wow and round it all up with I'll make love to you, I'll make love to you. This was exciting and dangerous stuff. I went to Little League tryouts at the school playground, which was the last kid chosen. It never returned. There were kids in my class who paid no attention, and it didn't seem to matter what to anybody, even the teachers. I thought it was unfair that we were treated the same, even though I was smarter. I learned not to be the kid raising his hand with the answer. On Fridays, half the class attended catechism at the Catholic church around the street. My parents explained why I couldn't go. We didn't believe in God, and I knew not to say a word about that dangerous secret. I walked home at the end of every day alone. It all seems glowing in retrospect. At the time, I was lonely. I had few friends outside of my sisters. One late spring afternoon, Miss LaChapelle, our homeroom teacher, who had developed an affection for me, her little prodigy, said she had a special announcement for the class. Jann, as I then spelled it, Wenner won't be with us next year because he's going off to a private boarding school. I had never said a word about it to my classmates, and I cringed at Miss LaChapelle's revelation. My folks thought I should get a better education, I presumed, but it also must have been time to get me out of the house. I had become too hard to handle. When my father took me to Los Angeles for the admissions interview at the Chadwick School, I fought for a white jacket with silver threads in it, but of course ended up with a charcoal gray suit. It was time to leave. My sister stood under the giant oak tree in front of our house and waved goodbye as my dad and I drove off. I was 12 years old. It was the end of Rainbow Road. End of chapter 2.